All right. Hi, everyone. We can get started. Kellee Lustalo. I'm the Associate Director for the Humanities Center here in the Boston campus. I'd like to welcome you all to our fourth Faculty Works in Progress presentation for this semester. We are very excited to have with us today Dean Kellee Tsai. When I took over the planning for the Works in Progress series earlier this year, it was a priority for us to have Dean Tsai as a part of the series. After all, despite being a dean, she's a researcher like many of us in this room. So for an hour at least, Dean Tsai will be able to lean into that other aspect of her professional identity as scholar and share with us what she's been thinking about lately. So Dean Tsai is, of course, a political scientist specializing on the political economy of China with an emphasis on party-state capitalism and the surveillance industry. Our presentation today is entitled Digital Panopticon, Platform Authoritarianism in China. In this talk, Dean Tsai will examine the vast network of AI surveillance platforms that China uses to monitor both citizens and civil servants, and consider the extent to which these platforms achieve their intended objectives. Dean Tsai draws on several case studies, which I'm sure she'll discuss, in hopes that we can gain a better understanding of how platform authoritarianism functions in practice. Doing so, I think, the argument, will have widespread implications for how we think about increased integration of AI into government operations worldwide, beyond Chinese context. So join me in welcoming Dean Tsai.
Thank you, Getty. Thanks to the Humanities Center for inviting me, and thanks to everyone who's here in the room and also online, including colleagues from Oakland and Lithuania, apparently. I'm really excited to be chatting with you here as a fellow faculty member. For the next hour, I am not a dean. Yes. The project that I'm going to be talking about is in collaboration with a former graduate student and postdoc. He goes by Jimmy. He is now an assistant professor at Chinese University of Hong Kong in Shenzhen. And when he was a graduate student, we worked very closely together in looking at the political economy of China's surveillance industry to try and understand how did China go from ground zero with like no infrastructural capacity, surveillance, digital surveillance, and needing to import surveillance equipment from the US, Japan, and Germany to really, truly dominate the global surveillance equipment industry. Now, the two largest suppliers of surveillance hardware in the world are Chinese. That's Hikvision and Dahua. In a piece called Securing Authoritarian Capitalism, we also looked at the mutually dependent relationship between private firms and different bureaucracies and levels of government in China's party state. During COVID, you probably noticed that the application of digital surveillance and technology in general really accelerated in many parts of the world, including in China. In China, robots were delivering meals to people in quarantine facilities. Drones were used to ensure compliance with lockdowns, and every locality had an app for its own contact tracing. And governance became increasingly digitized through these smart city digital platforms. What we're calling platform authoritarianism refers to an aspirational form of centralized digital governance that centralizes and integrates data that's usually scattered across different bureaucracies and levels of government. Major Chinese cities now all have a data platform in a command center where local officials and command center managers can see real-time data through a mega display screen like that. In terms of technology, at the front end, these platforms have various sensors and surveillance cameras, which use facial recognition, video structuring, AI algorithms, and other technical means to transform images, biometric data, physical data, chemical data to identify very specific problems like exceeding pollution control standards, traffic accidents, or if there's a group of gathering that protesters. Identified problems from this tech then takes the form of an early warning to the monitoring system. And when a warning is issued, then the command center can then mobilize grassroots enforcement officers, staff, to deal with the issue immediately. The technological aspirations of these platforms are arguably totalitarian. Historically and theoretically, the precursors to this controlling aspiration include early cyberneticists who believed that computerizing government functions would lead to greater control. Leninists and social modernists also believed in social engineering types. And during the Deng Xiaoping era, which was from the late 1970s until the late 1990s, the government actually adopted a missile expert. His name was Song Jian, who came up with a cybernetic population model to justify China's very strict one-child policy during those decades. Skipping ahead to 2020. China's tech giant, Alibaba, designed a city brain for Hangzhou in Zhejiang province. Xi Jinping, the General Secretary and President of China, is a real fan of biological metaphors. After he visited the city brain, which was very wide, he declared that cities are living bodies and organisms. We should respect cities, establish a sense of full cycle management, and strive to explore new ways of modernizing the governance of megacities. Other cities in China really quickly picked up on this discursive signaling. They saw that the general secretary liked the city brain in Hangzhou, and so they all started emulating Hangzhou and established their own city brains that look like that. Next. In practice, these platforms look just awe-inspiring. They're really, really impressive. You walk into one of these rooms and you're just kind of taken over. It's kind of like when IMAX first started. You go in and it feels like a 3D, if not 4D experience. So they're fantastic for showing officials that are visiting from other, officials visiting from Beijing or other countries. You click, please. Thanks. But they don't always function as intended. This is a photo of a horrific flooding of the subways in Beijing. The censor knew that the weather forecast, they knew that the floods were coming, but there was a glitch in the system. So public transportation people were not evacuated from flood zones in time. Dozens of people drowned unnecessarily. A similar case occurred in Zhengzhou, Henan, which is the most populous province in China. Zhengzhou is also the site of Foxconn, which produces iPhones. Anyway, similar flooding systems are imperfect. Yes. So what I'm going to talk about today is actually a combination of 3 different papers. Don't ask me why I tried to do that, but I'm using today's talk to try and see if Jimmy and I can condense them into maybe 2 papers. And I'm going to focus on the first 3 topics there. And then I'll give an update on China's most recent AI Plus initiative that was just unveiled in August of this year. And I'll touch just briefly on the final, more provocative issue of whether China is, quote unquote, exporting authoritarianism through its exports of surveillance technology. In terms of background, until the early 2000s, China did not rely on any digitalized forms of surveillance. Surveillance took the form, it was very labor intensive. During the Cultural Revolution, it was based on people just reporting on one another. During non-cultural revolution times, there were work units that people lived and worked at, and the work unit would monitor the behavior of people who were registered to it. But the 9/11, and then the London bombings on July 7th, 2005, really caught the attention of China's leaders. First, they were shocked by the vulnerability of the US and the UK, but then they were also really impressed by how the US and the UK were able to use surveillance tech to track down terrorists. And they wanted to learn how to develop that kind of infrastructure in China, especially in the lead up to Beijing's hosting of the 2008 Olympics. I mean, China wanted to put its best foot forward. Nothing could go wrong. They didn't want anything to go wrong. So various Chinese officials and technocrats at this point, Chinese leadership comprised mainly of engineers. And China ended up, so they visited New York and London. They saw how data was stored. Most of it was stored locally. This becomes relevant later on. And China ended up procuring its first generation of data exchange equipment from Western multinationals like IBM and Cisco, which became the backbone of China's surveillance network. Honeywell sold China video surveillance systems. And then there were some joint ventures, like a collaboration between Huawei and a 3Com, which is US based, that facilitated the integration of advanced networking. Then another key company, C&K Systems, there should be an ampersand there, a US company that specializes in infrared radar systems for military applications, actually provided China with urban alarm systems. They adapted the military radar systems for civilian use in China. And many of the earliest Chinese security firms actually partnered with C&K Systems as agents or partners of C&K, learning from their technologies and then eventually developing their own capabilities. Yes. Since then, China has invested in several major surveillance initiatives, starting with Golden Shield, which was intended to create an integrated information system for public security that relied on IBM and Cisco equipment. By the time that Safe Cities and Skynet were launched in 2010, Chinese firms were increasingly able to develop innovative solutions that met the needs of China's vast public security. Public security is basically police in China, apparatus. And they really needed to develop tech solutions for the massive amount of surveillance data that these cameras were collecting. Two private domestic firms, Hikvision and Dahua, they were the ones who were able to develop large-scale video data centralization platforms with, and this is really critical technology, video compression technology that was tailored to the needs of China's public security system. And they did it in a much more sophisticated way than Western firms were able to provide. And then meanwhile, other private domestic firms also developed cutting-edge facial recognition and behavior detection technology. One thing that I think it's important to understand in terms of context is that China has a fragmented authoritarian system. People often assume that it's just totalitarian. It's not that straightforward. It's a very large, complex. There are vertical bureaucracies, that deal with functional areas like finance, agriculture, education, and then there are all these horizontal layers of government. You've got the central government, you've got provinces, cities, counties, districts, and so on, all the way down to the neighborhood level. And because of that, coordinating the information that's flowing in the vertical bureaucracies with horizontal levels of governance has been a perennial challenge for China. Now, these issues plague other organizations and other political systems as well. But it is particularly acute and problematic in a country as large and complex as China. So fragmented authoritarianism is plagued by two main types of problems. The first, in the vertical, in terms of the vertical bureaucracies, there are all sorts of principal agent issues. Lower levels tend to hide information or just not fully report information to higher levels. And as a result, there's often selective policy implementation because the higher levels have input information, and vice versa. At the horizontal level, then you've got these different levels of government that just don't share data. They feel like they're territorial about it, or they're nervous that it's proprietary, like state secrets. They're very protective of their own data. And so these are the problems that platform authoritarianism is trying to solve. So there are two types of solutions for the two types of information problems. The supervisory type of control is an intra-department monitoring platform. So this is for like within a particular bureaucracy, let's call it like finance or agriculture, or even more fundamentally, even public security departments like the police, even within a single police department, public security bureau, different levels are not sharing, we're not sharing information. So this intra-departmental monitoring platform is customized for very particular regulatory or enforcement. Commercially, they're known as domain one. Pingtai. They're used for various digital public sector projects, like there's smart public security, smart environmental protection, smart city management, smart market supervision. You may notice that everything is now prefaced by smart. And the coordinated control monitoring platforms, those are used with agencies that have a really strong incentive for like interdepartmental coordination, like political and legal committees, comprehensive government offices, emergency management bureaus, and various local authorities at different administrative levels, like at the street level, township level, district. And the coordinated control ones are called integrated platforms or comprehensive brains. And examples of this would include smart emergency management, smart comprehensive governance, and smart communities, which is also known as the Brightness Project. To make this more concrete, I'll discuss examples of both types. Under Xi Jinping's leadership, protecting the environment became a so-called hard target in the annual performance evaluation systems of cadres. In the past, there were different types of hard targets. Like during the Deng era, enforcing the one-child policy was considered a hard target, especially in rural areas where they were more likely to have more than one child. Later on in the reform era, economic growth, GDP growth, and securing foreign investment became hard targets for localities, and they would just scramble to grow and to attract foreign direct investment at all costs, labor, regardless of what happened to workers, regardless of what happened to the environment. Well, environmental protection is now a hard target in the officials' cadre evaluation system. And that means that the Environmental Protection Bureau and all of its offices going down to the localities, they went from being just like an afterthought to truly empowered to enforce environmental protection regulations and standards. And so now major manufacturing cities, and even those that don't have a huge amount of manufacturing, have introduced environmental data collection and monitoring platforms. The data that's collected by these platforms include metrics like water quality, air quality, pollution emissions, sewage discharge data. And what they do is they put at key points in different parts of bodies of water, of rivers, there are these Internet of Things IoT sensors that are installed next to video surveillance cameras, so they can really pinpoint when there's an increase in some sort of pollutant, and they can identify who's putting the pollutant into the water as well. So all this data is displayed on the screen of the Environmental Protection Bureau through data visualization, which then enables the command center to see what's going on in real time and dispatch someone, enforcement agents, to deal with it in a timely manner. Oh, yeah. So you can imagine that from the perspective of the Environmental Protection Bureau, this is really helpful. Like suddenly now you can tell what's going on. And they'll say, yeah, now we know exactly who's doing well. And they also note that transparency creates invisible pressure on us. And they reported, this was in fieldwork, every month the towns that rank the lowest in environmental protection are internally informed and criticized. So just, yeah. By contrast, the agents that also work for the Environmental Protection Bureau, they find it much more suffocating. They say, not only at our level, but at the state, province, and city, they've also installed these independent environmental monitoring sites that are controlled by their system. They call these things eagle eyes. And they said, we can't interfere with these eagle eyes because their staff are dispatched to maintain the system. Our local data is also monitored by the higher levels at any given point in time. So we face the pressure of their review. I'll skip over some of the technology underlying this and move to next. An example of coordinated control is urban grid management. Urban China has basically been carved up into various grids, and there's an extensive hierarchy of personnel that staff these grids. So just to give you a sense of how labor intensive it is, a typical grid would have a police officer who's responsible for several grids, a grid director, a grid attendant who could be full-time or part-time, a number of assistant grid attendants, and then all grids usually have a party cell, Communist Party cell or party branch. And then at like at the ground level, sometimes they rely very heavily on volunteers. They might be retirees. They wear red armbands. And anyway, so there's a lot of people involved in grid management. The surveillance equipment can provide early warning signs of crowds gathering, if there's a fight or a brawl. A number of these cities rely on migrant labor from other parts of China, rural China. And so they don't have like a stable residential registration. And sometimes that population is associated with breaking out in fights, though urban residents that have registration break out in fights all the time. I've seen that a lot in China, in Beijing and other parts of China. But anyway, it can pick up on, let's say someone parks illegally somewhere, or there are overflowing trash cans, public trash cans somewhere, fire hazards, so on and so forth. And so an official that's in charge of this platform admitted, before we didn't really know where and what the frontline law enforcement teams were doing. Now we always know their whereabouts. We can mobilize them immediately and deal with an issue instantly if something happens. And, okay. Yeah, and so the command center will receive notice of an emergency incident, and then they can mobilize police forces and call the nearest grid employee through the dispatch console. And then that information is concurrently sent to the intelligent terminals, the smart terminals of the police officers. And then all of this is reported on a GIS visualization platform. Most people in this room are probably familiar with the concept of the Panopticon, which was a prison design developed by the philosopher Jeremy Bentham in the late 18th century. And then in his book on Discipline and Punish, Foucault further discussed the implications of that, which is like the perception that one is always under surveillance leads prisoners, citizens to regulate themselves, because you never know when you might be being watched. So you sort of assume that you could be being watched, and therefore, even if no one's there, you self-regulate and conform with the expected behavior. Just to take a step back about the analytic implication of one of the major analytic implications of this project is that reliance on digital governance has implications that go beyond just state control over society. In political science and sociology, we talk a lot about state-society relations and look at that power dynamic. That's been the focus of many generations of research agendas. What we're looking at here is that there are intrastate relations that are at stake here too. The introduction of digital governance changes the relationship between higher levels of the state and lower levels of the state as well. So it's actually quite disempowering for frontline workers, the staff of the state, and it limits their autonomy. So this is changing intrastate relations as well. You know, like my attempt at a New Yorker, that was I don't know if it works. Next, please. If what I've talked about so far sounds incredibly dystopian and maybe too good to be true from a dictator's perspective, it is. First of all, these things are really expensive to maintain. It's not just the financial cost, it's also and paying people to maintain them. I mean, there's after they've been established, you need people who understand how to work them. New data constantly has to be uploaded, and so that's enough on that. Let me go into a little more detail next. Yeah, so super expensive. Local governments in China have been facing a structural fiscal deficit for many years now, and during COVID, they were forced to spend so much money to enforce the draconian lockdowns and PPE and COVID testing and all of that. That really drained them. There's also a real estate crisis going on. So after 2020, local governments have just barely, they're not able to pay the wages of their civil servants. They're not able to pay teachers to teach. Like they just like very fundamental expenditures are being strained. They're taking out more and more debt. So local government debt is a ballooning crisis in China as well. So under those circumstances, you know what, they're not investing as much into these surveillance platforms anymore. They, some have deactivated their systems altogether just to save on costs. When these systems were first being implemented, they hired a lot of extra staff to figure out what was going on and to maintain them. But many of these positions have since been eliminated. And now many localities only activate their local brains when they're visiting officials to check things out. So they'll like, okay, turn on the electricity. But because of the fiscal constraints that are going on right now, at the same time, fieldwork revealed that in localities where there are a lot of private entrepreneurs, the tax department and the police department have actually joined forces to collect back taxes from private entrepreneurs, going back in some cases like 20 years. They'll just say, you haven't paid like 2 decades worth of taxes, pay up now. Yeah, very predatory. And then meanwhile, local transportation departments have been using surveillance technology to ramp up fines for traffic violations, like carrying excessive weights on a truck, speeding. Yeah, I think this is sort of self-explanatory. So IoT technologies can collect a lot of data, but a lot of the raw textual and numeric data still has to be coded manually. This is rapidly changing, but as of when we were doing our research, it still required manual coding by lower level staff called graded data workers. The data is often like really poor in quality. There's inconsistent formatting. It just makes automated processing really difficult. So some of these grid data workers just said, you know, these systems, they're not as smart as they're made out to be. You know, they still require humans to make sure that it's accurate. Oh, wow, it's 12:30. Okay. These systems are set up to serve managers, not the people who staff them. And so it can be really frustrating for the people who are trying to do the work because they don't have access to full information. Sometimes they'll be dispatched. Frontline staff will be dispatched to take care of the situation, but because they don't have all the information, they don't really know what to do, or like they can't diagnose the underlying source of the problem. Very frustrating. Another thing is that because these are, the tasks are all generated by algorithms, sometimes the algorithms will be redundant. And even after a task has been completed, the algorithm will still say, do it again, you know, do it. And so then, you know, like the staff are caught in a loop, like, I did it. So I guess I got to do it again. And this was really a problem during COVID when there was a lot of door-by-door surveillance of households to make sure that they were in compliance with not just the quarantine, but maybe they had a household member that had been identified as positive, and there was a lot of repetition. Next, this is one thing I really want to focus on, which is under these conditions, frontline staff feel much heavier burden on them than they did in the past without digital monitoring. Work-specific cell phones are all they all come with a GPS device. And so, you know, they'll say the higher ups always know where we are at any given point in time. So we can't turn off our phones. We can't venture beyond the grid that we're supposed to be in. And we can't even stay put in one place for too long, or it'll look like we're not working. So they have to keep walking around. I mean, it's just very alienating and disempowering. So, and not to mention that sometimes they're algorithmic misjudgments, and they're just frustrated because they know it's not the right thing to do, but they still feel like they have to do it, or they'll be penalized. But given the fact that it's simply not practical for frontline staff to listen to the algorithm all the time, they've come up with a range of coping strategies or adaptive response. They're basically, we've identified, oh yeah, that's correct. Yeah, we've identified 4 basic adaptive strategies that hinge on the clarity of the mandate and the severity of the consequences for non-compliance. Next. So like any self-respecting social scientist, I have a little 2x2 here that shows you, where these 4 coping strategies lie. Next. Let's start with non-compliance, where you just ignore the algorithm and just don't do it. Sometimes the street level bureaucrats do this when they know that the responsible bureaucracy just doesn't have the capacity to enforce discipline. And it's usually because they know this department or office is so poor that they really can't do anything about it. And examples of this would include smart food safety monitoring and smart market monitoring. Yeah, food safety. So at the local level, the business administration and food safety supervision offices just aren't very well funded. So one interview, he said that the systems we don't really run these systems. We just use it for data storage. Now, if there are public complaints like an outbreak of food poisoning or there's an impending health inspection, then the managers will turn on platform to facilitate their responses. But most of the time, they're still just, walking the streets and going door to door rather than relying on the platform. And in other cases, like in rural areas with the Brightness project, the tech is super fancy, but they don't know how to operate these handheld AI devices, so they don't use it. And then some trash. Yeah, when it comes to public trash cans, much of the work is done by low-paid informal workers, so they just feel less urgency in responding to an algorithmic command. We'll get to it. Now, compliance happens when frontline staff, they know their task is a political mandate and they will be disciplined for non-compliance. So they definitely do it. An example would be when a traffic monitoring system detects a traffic accident, it immediately alerts the nearest traffic police officer, tells the officer to arrive in the scene within a specified amount of time. The response time and the arrival time of the traffic police are directly connected to their performance evaluation and individual performance. So they do it. I'm looking at Steve here. In the maritime management system, maritime law enforcement officers are similarly strictly mandated to intercept vessels within a specified amount of time when their system detects a violation by a vessel in their jurisdiction. Now, sometimes they may not agree with what the algorithm is telling them to do. Like maybe it's just like a fishing boat rather than a real threat, but they still have to intercept that little fishing boat and bring it in and write it up and all of that. Adaptive collusion refers to the coping strategies of frontline employees and their immediate superiors in response to higher level political assessments. So this is when there's strong political pressure, but the frontline officials, they know that they can still meet their assessment requirements by accomplishing only some of the targets. So they know that they're not going to be judged based on algorithmic judgments alone. And so they might tolerate just like partial compliance if they can get away with it. And this is the case with some environmental indicators. Originally, the environmental platform said every single indicator is equally important, but in practice, there's some localities that really depend heavily on manufacturing. And so if they can get away with sliding on a couple of indicators so that local economic growth doesn't totally suffer, they might still do that. Next. Adaptive collusion, sorry, was Zhou Shuigang at Stanford came up with that concept. Thanks. And then next, performative governance. Isa Ding identified this in her book on the performative state. And this is basically when, they're gonna try, and they're going to make it look like they're trying, but there's very little effectiveness. And there's a tendency for grid workers to do this. So grid workers, it's grunt work. It's miserable. They have to fill a quota. And so to fill their quota, they're just going to do the easiest things rather than the more complicated ones, just to fill their quota. So it's kind of performative. They'd much rather deal with parking and garage issues rather than saying, you might have a spy hiding in your neighborhood. Can you disentangle that? I'm like, oh gosh, I'd rather not, it's just complicated. Next. None of these are static. These are very dynamic categories, they can shift depending on the nature of the political imperative at that time. In China, there are these things called campaigns. They're not political campaigns where people run for office. They're societal campaigns where the party is saying, you must do this urgently. So they're like if you need blue skies, clean streets, and no overflowing garbage cans for a major international event like the Olympics or an APEC summit or the Summer Davos, full on compliance suddenly activates, like everyone's on the job. But these types of mobilizations, it's like crisis management, that they're really exhausting and unsustainable. Like once the pressure subsides, it's over, you know, people revert to performative compliance or just non-compliance. Okay, well, given everything that I've just described, administrative costs, information overload, bureaucratic gaming, implementation failures, one might reasonably ask, is China still investing in these systems? Why not scale back? Why not admit it's not working as intended? Well, the answer is that China is not scaling back, and arguably they're doubling down. Next. Just a few months ago, the People's Republic of China State Council just released an AI Plus initiative. It's a massive, ambitious, comprehensive plan to integrate AI into virtually every sector, and you'll see that governance capacity is one of the 6 domains. I don't know if you can see: science and tech, industrial upgrading, consumption upgrading, people's well-being, governance, and global cooperation are the 6 areas. So China is planning for AI, especially the DeepSeek LLM, to solve the implementation problems that I've just discussed. This isn't about building more cameras or expanding surveillance infrastructure. That investment has actually stopped in many places due to fiscal constraints. AI Plus is a shift in strategy. It's going from collecting more data to processing existing data better. It's going from expanding camera networks to using algorithms to make sense of what's already been collected. It's going from manual bureaucratic coordination to automated document processing and information sharing. We're trying to decide whether we should call it platform authoritarianism 2.0, same problems, technological solution. We haven't gotten there. Okay, I had all this theory that I was going to talk about, but can't do that. So let's just go to the next slide. And I think one thing that might seem paradoxical is just as China has released this really ambitious AI Plus initiative, it's actually also regulating much more heavily surveillance applications and introducing new restrictions. So facial recognition limits. So now hotels, banks, train stations, and airports can no longer rely only on facial recognition. They have to offer alternative verification methods as well. And the official justification is that this is about protecting personal privacy and preventing abuse. Our interviewee said this really isn't about privacy concerns at all. It's about control over the data, because what happened was private companies, real estate companies, retail chains, hotels, they were all collecting a massive amount of facial recognition data privately. And one example was a real estate company was using facial recognition to analyze all the customers that were visiting properties multiple times, and then they were adjusting the price based on the frequency of visits, and that just sparked total public outrage. Anyway, the government's concern wasn't just public backlash. It was that all this data was being held by private companies and not accessible to the police. So the government realized that private firms were building parallel surveillance systems that they couldn't access or control. And so this rollback is really about reasserting state control over who gets to surveil, not so much about protecting citizens' privacy. The second regulation in, I think that was August, yeah. Now 10 government ministries came together to issue measures for ethical management of AI tech. And it basically reviews mandatory ethics review for AI projects. Like if you're dealing with anything involving life, health, human dignity, the environment, or public order, you have to submit a 30-day ethics review process. I won't be able to go into detail because time is running out, and I really want to leave some time for you to engage with me. The third one, regulation in September, was on content labeling. And it just says that all AI generated content has to be labeled both explicitly and implicitly. So explicit labeling would be visible labels that users can actually see, like whether text, audio, or graphics it has to say this is AI generated. And then implicit labeling means technical labels that are embedded in file metadata, including the service provider's name, content reference number, and timestamps. And there is concern about authenticity and traceability here. Go into that at this particular moment. Another reason about kind of scaling back on the use of facial recognition was also to make China more appealing to foreign visitors and investors. It was really a turnoff. So it's, you know, it makes China seem less Orwellian to outsiders, even as the state maintains deep surveillance capacity where it matters. There are all sorts of big questions about like whether China can actually execute this massive AI integration while maintaining centralized control. There are unresolved questions like, can it actually improve government efficiency while ensuring that AI doesn't find a way to challenge party authority? These are big questions. I'm not going to be able to get through a lot of other things I want to talk about, but I did want to pause just for a moment for personal reflection about the study of Chinese politics, because when I first started my career in late 90s, early 2000s, there was a real division of labor between people who studied Chinese domestic politics and Chinese foreign policy. And I think that divide has really eroded because what's going on within China's domestic political economy, which is what I've been studying all along, has global implications. Like even within the period that I've been working with Jimmy on China's surveillance industry, we went from looking at how startups in Guangdong and Zhejiang were competing with one another for the domestic public security market to the fact that the domestic market is now saturated, and now these homegrown surveillance firms are multinationals that are exporting their technology all over the global south. Next. There should be one more. Well, there should be like 10 more, actually. This slide is just a footnote. The most recent edition of The Economist has a piece that talks about China providing police training to 138 other countries since 2000. And 82% of authoritarian regimes in the world have received police training from China. That's just a footnote. Next. This is the COVID era map that shows parts of the world that are using Chinese and US surveillance tech. The map is dated because since then, the banning of Chinese tech from the US and Europe has led the largest surveillance companies to diversify to the global south. And US tariffs on China have further pushed it onto other markets like Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Latin America. And next, surveillance exports in Africa have been particularly controversial. They haven't necessarily been effective. I won't. Maybe the next slide will summarize some of the reasons why there are limits in transplanting China's surveillance platforms. Most countries don't have the kind of centralized coordination that China has. Inconsistent use of equipment, lack of accountability. Well, China certainly has inconsistent use of equipment and partial lack of accountability. Unstable power and internet infrastructure. China's much stronger here in terms of infrastructure. Insufficient technical expertise, that can happen anywhere because these platforms are getting more and more sophisticated. Insufficient funds to maintain, that's like universal at this point. Public distrust of surveillance, more intense outside of China than within China. But even within China, some people, feel can take pause about the amount of surveillance that's going on. Oh, okay, great. I kind of made it while leaving some time. So, yeah, summary of initial findings. Platform authoritarianism requires like actual people to execute it for them to function as intended. Digital governance has very much eroded the autonomy that street level bureaucrats used to exercise. And this was actually really helpful during a part of China's reform era, where local officials would collaborate with local entrepreneurs to get things done. Just like, they would grease the wheels, they would get things done. It wasn't always just like extreme corruption. It was like just getting things done. And now they can't just get things done because the algorithm won't let them. Yeah, the smart city solutions that Huawei and other Chinese companies are exporting to the global south, they're not working any better there than they were in rural China, and probably worse off, actually. And then I just wanted to say, in terms of next steps in our research agenda, I'm working with Xiao Shen over there, who's an assistant research professor in political science, that just joined us this year. We're going to be looking at the political and geopolitical implications of reliance of other Chinese digital infrastructure, including submarine cables, 5G, cloud services, data centers, and semiconductors. So I'm sorry I tried to cram too much into this talk, but I did want to leave some time for engagement. So thank you for listening through all of that. Maya.
That was a really fascinating presentation. Thank you so much. My question is about kind of how you connect all of this to China's crackdown on, political disagreement or censorship, just sort of how it executes its suppression of its citizenry. Is it mainly flowing through this grid and all of these processes you described despite failures, or is it actually mainly occurring through other avenues? And I'm thinking beyond the Panopticon effect, but
yeah, so there's already a fair amount of work that's really focused on how China's surveillance affects its citizens, and especially targeted populations like in Xinjiang and Tibet and Hong Kong, for that matter. So yeah, there's a lot of work on that already. It's done through a combination of public security as well as state security. There's coordination at that level. So it's related, but that piece has developed somewhat independently of this more kind of domestic governance piece. But they do come together because sometimes localities will be informed that, you may have a spy, or you've got someone visiting, what's going on. I had like a really creepy experience where Jimmy was in China, in Shenzhen, and we were just talking about his dissertation on WhatsApp. We don't usually use WhatsApp, but we did. And then after we hung up, he got in touch with me right away and said, I just got a visit from public security asking who called you from Hong Kong. And I was like, what'd you say? He said, I was just talking to my dissertation advisor. It's like, did they ask you for money? I was like, no. So they were just cracking down on financial fraud. So there's this like really sophisticated there are all these like major scams going on. So both of us were really spooked because we're here studying surveillance and public security, and it had nothing to do with that. They just thought, oh, a call from Hong Kong. Maybe they were trying to scam you out of your life savings. Yeah. Right.
This is wonderful. I have a million questions. The first is sort of about your own research process and getting this data, accessing all this information. How much on the groundwork what's that all about? That just sounds so fascinating. But of course, the bigger, deeper, harder question is about protections and policy protections. And just thinking about the difference in governments and the increasingly less differentiated, America, China. I mean, I want to know if our policies protect us in ways that the Chinese are not protected against this level of intrusion into every detail of life. And if China has its own sort of policy protections about, this massive use of, surveillance.
Okay, yeah, two very different questions. First, throughout my career, I've done a lot of field work in China and India and other parts of the world. But in recent years, I haven't been able to re-enter China. The last time I tried, I was detained for 5 hours. But I've been working with graduate students, postdocs, and others who still have access to China. So I am unable to do it directly, but I can still interview people who have left China, like in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has always been the landing point of a lot of people that were fleeing China, and then people that are no longer outside of, out of China. So I'm unable to do direct field work in China at this point. I mean, I guess I could. I just prefer not to risk it at the moment.
Of course.
In terms of policy protections, oh, this could be like, I'm looking at fans here because this could be like an entire additional 2-hour seminar. So Europe with the GDPR has the strongest data protection rights, and their entire ethos is about protecting individual data and privacy. And then the US is much more hands-off because big tech has the upper hand. The regulation is not as centralized, it's more fragmented, states vary. In China, it's more centralized, and actually personal data protections, a whole bunch of new regulations have just been issued, and it sounds like, oh, they're actually trying harder than the US. But in fact, it's really so that the party state has access to that data, and that private firms must hand over that data if there's a potential national security or domestic security concern. I think you're asking a broader question about what's going on in the US, and that I'm not sure we can quite engage adequately right here at the moment. Steve?
Yeah, I guess I just maybe piggyback off of that here, because to some extent, and talk me out of this if I shouldn't be, I'm coming away somewhat a little more optimistic than when I came in with the title of your talk, in that by really your nitty-gritty side of how dysfunctional basically it is to try to execute this top-down happening things, and how people respond and how systems respond. It gives you some sense that even if the policies aren't all there, achieving that totalitarian outcome here is really, really hard.
Not everything all the time, not all at once, right?
Yeah.
When there's certain priorities, China can get it done. But it mobilizes everything to get it done. But and then at some point the factories have to reopen and the skies become cloudy again. And it's impossible to be in that emergency crisis mode all the time. But I think the hope is that AI can facilitate some of that.
That'll get scary.
Make it less labor intensive, make it more automated. I think that's
But isn't there this core disconnect? You're also, I mean, part of that adaptive non-compliance or the going through the motions. Performative governance is the core reality that the localized reality is almost impossible. It's not impossible to be seen through data, but it's almost impossible to interpret it correctly at that higher level. That context is so important at the localized level, and therefore it makes it really, really difficult. Not to say if the power is up there, you can drive people to do silly things at the local level, but you end up basically driving people to do silly things, right?
No, it's a really good point. And the thing is, you can only mobilize so far. If resources are limited, the incentives become a little bit more limited too.
Yeah. Thank you. It's a great presentation.
Here's a question online.
Oh, online?
Philip.
Oh, Philip, hi.
Hello, Dean Tsai, how are you? Thank you very much for that very interesting, fascinating presentation. I just have a quick question. I'm curious to hear what sort of parallels you might see in the China case. I know the temptation is to look at digital governance, looking at what maybe other governments may or may not be doing with technology and surveillance. But the parallel that I am hearing as you're describing what China is doing is maybe what other companies here in the US, for instance, Amazon is doing in terms of surveilling their workers, monitoring their workers, and then also reactions by workers to try to circumvent or defeat those kinds of surveillance efforts. So I'm wondering if there's any sort of parallels between what China is doing and maybe what private actors in the US or companies are doing.
Absolutely, Philip. So Susanna Zuhoff at Harvard Business School has this great book on surveillance capitalism. I don't know why that came out of my mouth. What I really wanted to say is that it's actually the interviewees themselves who talked about, in Chinese, they called it Didihua, but in English, it would be the Uberization. They feel like gig workers. They're like, we feel like Amazon employees. I mean, they've drawn the parallel themselves. But instead of it being a private big tech, it's actually the government that's doing it to them in China. Well, the private techs are doing it to them too, to be fair. I mean, they're not any more considerate of human agency than Amazon and other big tech are. Second round, Maya.
If it's okay to ask a second question. I'm actually planning a workshop in India, as you know, that will have one theme on digital public infrastructure. And so one of the questions is whether it's possible to develop some sort of internationally cooperative framework for digital platforms that would involve things like standards on payments and digital IDs and other things.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any hope of China contributing or joining to this on some level? I mean,
I think China would love to participate
okay,
because if the standards, they want to be at the table when there's standard setting. And that's one thing they learn. And that, I mean, and this came from the privates like Hikvision and Dahua. They were just, I mean, they started from nothing. And the way that they became so influential was because of lack of knowledge in the public sector about the technical standard. This is very technical stuff. So it's really the engineers that are designing this that can explain what is appropriate, what is realistic, what is scalable, what is enforceable. I mean, I imagine China would love to be at the table of any standard setting conversation at the global level, international level. That would be my thoughts. I'm looking at Xiao in case she disagrees.
No, I agree.
No, you don't have to agree. We're collaborating, so we can disagree. Yeah.
Simon is up
Oh,
there.
Simon.
Well, I just realized the time, so I don't want to keep anybody late, but I have two quick questions. One was that I was wondering about what the level of sort of public consciousness of just everyday citizens who aren't necessarily working in, you know, for one of these city brains, what their understanding is of the level of surveillance. But the other question, if there's a shortage of time, the one that I'm most interested in is why do you think the government has you in their crosshairs? What did they pick up on you that they're concerned about?
More importantly. So I think for like your average urbanite in China, it's become normalized. I mean, everything is on an app. Everything is integrated. Your shopping, your entertainment, your bill paying, your transportation, like it's all it's all there. People are leaving digital footprints all the time. People haven't used cash in so many years. Even panhandlers don't accept cash. They use the QR code. So I think it's largely normalized. It doesn't mean, I mean, there have been various scandals and I think there's growing awareness of how disruptive it can't, not disruptive per se, but invasive it could be. But there's also acceptance of it because if you post something inappropriate, and when I mean inappropriate, I'm not talking about porn, like let's say the Union Jack flag in Hong Kong, and you get banned on WeChat. This happened to someone I know, like you're paralyzed for 2 weeks. You can't function. You cannot function as a human being. And so then it's like, okay, I won't post that sort of thing anymore. For me, I think it might be because one of my books is banned in China. It's on evolutionary governance under authoritarianism, and it had some co-authors from Taiwan. And so I think it was only after that I started experiencing some issues. I don't know. When I was detained, there were a lot of different people. One person standing in front of me with a camera, like for 5 hours, like they had 30-minute rotations of people. And then that person clearly had no idea why I was there. And then I tried to ask at the border, they had no idea. They just knew that I'd been flagged by Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but they had incomplete information. So there was no point in trying to reason with them. I mean, I knew full well because I study this. They were literally only doing their tiny little job and they had no idea why I was there. You know, the people that knew were nowhere near that building. So I can only speculate that it has to do with that book on an evolutionary governance under in China. Yeah, evolutionary authoritarianism in China.
Such important work. Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
I enjoyed this.
Yeah, join me in thanking Dean Tsai.